This guide will walk you through building a SharePoint site provisioning workflow application. Allowing end users to create SharePoint sites on demand without a governance model around your SharePoint environment can lead to unwanted sprawl and an unmanageable proliferation of sites over time. Automating a site creation and deletion process into your SharePoint governance model can help you better manage your architecture and still provide an efficient self-service request capability to your end users. This is helpful in many scenarios, such as providing a playground area for users to create temporary sites to test out collaboration or SharePoint application concepts. It can also help manage your site collection structure and organization by enforcing adherence to taxonomy rules, as well as effectively prevent the site sprawl that happens when site creation is left unchecked with your user base. Let's take an overall look at the basic flow of the application we're going to build to provision sites using K2 for SharePoint. We want to provide a mechanism where users can request SharePoint sites for projects, which they can either use temporarily, then delete, or decide to keep permanently after a period of time. To start the workflow, users will fill out a request by creating a new item in our SharePoint site request list. To provide feedback to the requester, the workflow system will use a list item event to update the request item's status to site pending in the SharePoint list. From there, the workflow will assign a user task to a designated individual to either approve the site request or reject it. If this individual actions the request with rejected, then the system will move on to notify the requester with an email message stating that their request has been rejected. From there, the system will update the request item's status to rejected in the SharePoint list and end the workflow. If an approval action comes out of the user task, then the system will move on and create the new subsite in the configured site collection location. From there, the request item will be updated with multiple values. The status will be set to site created, a URL column will be set with the URL to the new site, and the site created on date will be marked with the current date and time. The next step will assign a user task to the site requester that will escalate after 14 days and ask them if they want to keep the site permanently or delete it. If they want to keep the site, the system will send out an email message to the requester stating that the site will remain active and end the workflow. If the user decides to have the site deleted, the system will delete the site automatically and finally update the list item status to site deleted back in the SharePoint list. So now let's take a look at how to build this application using K2 for SharePoint. When you want to create a K2 app with a SharePoint list or library, one of the first things you may need to do is add the K2 for SharePoint app to your site and optionally configure the app parts on one of your web part pages. This step may have already been performed on your site, so if that's the case, you can skip ahead to the next step. Keep in mind that if you have created a subsite and want to build K2 apps within it, you'll need to follow these steps to add the K2 for SharePoint app to that site. To begin, in your SharePoint site, click on Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps. Under the Apps You Can Add heading, click on the K2 for SharePoint app to add it to your site. When you see the Do You Trust K2 for SharePoint dialog box, click on the Trust It button. You should be directed back to your site contents page, and after a few seconds you should see that the K2 for SharePoint app has been added to your site. This may take a few seconds, so I'll pause the video and then we'll wait for it to complete. The next thing we need to do is configure K2 for SharePoint. So click on the K2 for SharePoint app under Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps in order to bring up the configuration wizard. When the Configure Smart Forms Runtime URL screen appears, go ahead and leave the default value that is already entered in the Specify the URL field. Make note that your value may be a bit different than what you see here on this screen, but in any case, go ahead and click Next. The Configuring K2 Server Settings screen may take a few seconds to finish, so I'll pause the video here and then we'll come back when it's done. Okay, now that that's done, I'll go ahead and click Finish. And once the configuration screen has completed, click on the name of your site to return back to the main SharePoint site. Make note that your site's name may be a bit different than what you see on this screen. Once you're back on the main SharePoint site, click the Edit link in the toolbar. We want to add the K2 Work List app part to this page. So to do that, select the App Part button in the ribbon, and then select K2 Work List from the parts list. Then in the Add Part 2 drop-down list, select Rich Content. That's all we really have here on this screen. Click the Add button, and the K2 Work List web part will be added to your site landing page. And then in the toolbar above the ribbon, click the Save button to finish editing the landing page for this site. That's it for step 1 here, so let's go back and review what we did. Now that the K2 for SharePoint app is installed in your SharePoint site, you can start building K2 applications in this site. Note that the app has only been installed for the current site, so if you want to use the K2 for SharePoint app in other SharePoint sites, even subsites to this one, you may need to repeat these steps to enable the K2 for SharePoint app in those sites. We also added the K2 Worklist app part to this site so that users can open their K2 tasks from the SharePoint site. Adding the Worklist app part is optional. Your K2 application will still work just fine even if you do not add the K2 Worklist web part to this site. In this step, you will create a site request list in SharePoint that will act as the data for this application. Users will add new items to this list to request a new SharePoint site. When a new item is added to the list, the workflow will start, and as the workflow progresses, it will update the list item added by the user with the request and site status. Okay, now that we've added the K2 for SharePoint app to our SharePoint site, the next piece of the puzzle is to add the SharePoint list that we'll use to capture new SharePoint site requests, and then that list will be used to kick off the workflows as well. So to do that, I want to add a custom list, so I'm going to go into Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps. Under the Noteworthy section, I'm going to select the Custom List app. You can also get to that under the Apps You Can Add section as well, so I'll go ahead and select that here. At this point, the Adding Custom List window appears, so here what you want to do is put a name in for the list. I'll go ahead and call this list SharePoint Site Requests. And then from here we'll create it. After a few seconds, you should see the list created in your SharePoint site. So the next step we want to do is start adding columns for the list. So I'll select it to open it up. From here, open up the List ribbon menu at the top of the page and follow me into the List Settings option. Scroll down toward the Columns section, and here is where we'll create some of the columns that we need for this list. We want to do this now so that the Smart Object picks up these columns and makes it available for the workflow when we add the K2 application to this list. The first column I'll create is called Site Description. It's going to be a single line of text, and it's basically a value that will be used to hold the description for the new site requested by our user. We can leave all the rest of the settings under Additional Column Settings as the default values. I'm good with that, so I'll go ahead and save this column out. Now, the next column you'll create is going to be called Site Type. This column is important because we want it to contain a list of site templates available under the site collection where the user's new site will be created. So select the Choice column option to make sure this is a list. Because the workflow event that will create the new site needs to have a template available, we'll need to require that this column contains information. We don't need to enforce unique values, but we will provide the choices of Team Site and Project Site for this column. From here, we can leave the rest of the settings to their default values and save it back to SharePoint. For the next column, we'll call it Site Status. This column is going to be updated with status about the site's approval and creation by the workflow as the workflow progresses. Go ahead and leave it as a single line of text, and you can also leave the rest of the settings at their default values and save it out. Another column that we're going to create is called Link to Site. This column will be used to hold the URL value of the new site once it's created by the workflow. Go ahead and leave it also as a single line of text and leave all the default values the same and save it out. And the final column will be called Site Created On. This is going to be a date column that holds the date for when the workflow creates the site in SharePoint. So set it to date and time and save it out. Now, when you're done, your list settings for the column should look something like this. You should have a site description, site type, site status, link to site, and site created on. Now that we've done this, we can move on to create the K2 application against this SharePoint list. Let's talk about step 3. In this step, you will generate a new K2 application for the SharePoint site request list. You will use a wizard to generate data objects based on the SharePoint site request list, K2 generated smart forms to handle the add, edit, and display tasks for users, a blank workflow that starts when a new item is added to the list, and finally a page that includes reports for your new K2 application. In the toolbar for your SharePoint site request list, click on the List tab, and then click Application in the K2 group. You should see a Working on It screen for a few seconds here, and then when that finishes, you should see the Create K2 Application screen appear. From here, you can decide what K2 application elements should be created for your new K2 application. For this application, we will use Data, Forms, Workflow, and Reports. Let's take a look at the Data section where we tell K2 to create a smart object for this list. Put a check in the box next to Allow this smart object to be used in workflows, and then select List Library from the drop-down box that follows. This will expose the smart object generated for this list so that it is available for use in the workflow we're going to create. Now let's move on to the Forms section. Here you want to put a check in the box next to Use K2 Smart Forms as the new, edit, and display forms for this list library setting. By doing this, we are designating the generated K2 Smart Forms to replace the default forms that SharePoint uses to create, edit, and display list items. The next task will focus on the Workflow section. Name the workflow SharePoint Site Requests Workflow. Then make sure when a smart form is submitted is selected under the section called Specify how the workflow gets started. Then select New SharePoint Site Requests from the Form dropdown. This will start the workflow when a user clicks on the Submit button of the new item form. Finally, in the Reports section, make sure the checkbox is selected because we want K2 to generate a reports page for this application. And at the bottom of the page, we're ready to click OK. This will go and create the new K2 application. K2 will start to generate the new application, and after a few seconds, you should see the Workflow Designer appear. In this example, you will be dropped into the Workflow Design tool because you selected the Workflow option in the previous screen. This is the end of Step 3, so let's do a quick review. In this step, you created a new K2 application for the SharePoint Site Request list. For this application, we will use the list as the data source with smart objects for the application. K2 generated smart forms to let users add, display, and edit the data in the list, and also generated a new K2 workflow and new K2 reports. Okay, so in this step, you will add some steps to the workflow to implement the workflow design. Some of the steps are server tasks where K2 will perform operations like creating the new site or updating a list item in SharePoint. Other steps are user tasks where a human must make a decision before the workflow will continue. To help organize these steps, I'm going to break them down into smaller sections for each step. So let's start with step 4.1 and add a step to update the list item status. It's good practice to build in workflow status and feedback capabilities that provide information to your users about the status of a workflow process that they may have started. This workflow will use both email and list item updates to provide this type of capability. So for this step, I'm going to show you how to update the site status column that we created earlier with information about the progress of the workflow by using the Update List Item Workflow step. And because the previous step left us with an empty slot on this design canvas, we can fill that slot with the List Item Update wizard by opening up the General button from the ribbon menu at the top of the screen. From in there, we want to select List Items. Now you'll notice multiple list item steps available from the top menu here. Drag and drop the Update List item onto the empty slot in the workflow canvas. Here the Update List Item wizard appears on the Specify List window. You can leave the list item drop-down unchanged and set to its default values. But make note here, K2 keeps track of items that are associated with the workflow. These are known as item references. When you start a workflow from a list item in SharePoint, K2 will store a pointer or shortcut to that list item in the workflow's item references, so that you can interact with that list item later on in the workflow. By default, K2 assumes that you want to update the list item that started the workflow, so that is why we left the drop-down menu unchanged. Of course, you could use this step to update another list item in SharePoint, even an item in another list or site. But in this demo, we will only work with the list item that started the workflow. Now let's move on to the Specify Values window next. You'll use this window to provide values back to the SharePoint item tied to the item reference from the previous window. So in here, add the text Pending Approval to the Site Status field. This will allow the workflow to visibly provide a status update to users who want to check status of their request by going back to the list item in SharePoint. So go ahead and finish this wizard up. And now you should see that the first step of the workflow has been added to the design canvas. Before we can add more steps to the workflow, we must add a line, also called an outcome, that flows out of the Update List Item step. To do this, hover over the Update List Item step, and then select the little workflow step outcomes icon that appears in the upper right. In this window, you do have the ability to add multiple outcomes, but for this step in the workflow, we're only going to configure one. We'll look at how to add more than one outcome in a later step in this exercise. So click the Add button to add an outcome to the list and name it Continue. Save it by clicking OK, and now your design canvas will show an arrow to a new empty slot where you will drop the next step in the workflow. This is the end of step 4.1, so let's go back and review. You've created a workflow step where the system will set the site status column in SharePoint to pending approval. This is useful so that the user who originally registered the new site request can see what the request status is. In the next step, we will add the user task for the approver to decide whether or not to approve the site request. In step 4.2, we will add some human interaction to the workflow by adding an Approved Site user task. To handle this, we'll use the Smart Forms task on the next step in our workflow. In some organizations, security and governance models tend to require an approval audit trail when things like SharePoint sites and security groups get created on the network. We can meet that requirement in this workflow by adding a Smart Forms user task to capture approval for a user's site request. You can find the Smart Forms task under the Workflow Steps ribbon menu by opening the User Tasks menu group on the left side of the menu bar. Now, once you're in the User Tasks menu, drag and drop the Smart Forms task down to the empty slot on your design canvas. The first window that appears is the User Task window in this wizard. This provides a place for you to name this step. In this case, I'm going to call it Approve New Site Request. You also get a box to provide instructions to your user that will be doing this approval. In this box, I'm going to say, please review and approve or reject the new site request. The next box down is where you'll add your actions for this step. And here, I'm going to put approve and reject. And when you do this, it will create two new outcomes when you finally save the wizard back to the canvas. These actions will also populate the actions drop-down box that appears on the user's smart form when they go to work their task. So we're good with this setting here, so move on to the user form screen next. If it's not already set as the default, select Edit SharePoint Site Requests as our smart form for the users to use. It is an editable form, and that's because we want the approver to make changes to the site name or description just in case they need to. So we'll move on from here. K2 Smart Forms have powerful and flexible rules and can be modified with different layouts, styles, and much more. While we will not be editing the auto-generated smart forms for this build guide, just understand that the screen displayed here is sometimes used to change the sequence in which rules are executed on the smart form, especially if that smart form was customized. Now move on to the participant screen. Here you're going to decide who the task should be assigned to. For this application, you will use a specific person as the approver for this new site request, as opposed to letting the user select the person when they fill out the form. You can use the People Search box on the right side of the window to look up the name of the person whom you'd like to assign this review task. Feel free to assign it to the account that you logged into this computer with. For this instance, I'm going to assign this task to Bob, so to do this, I'll enter his name in the search box on the right. Then when it appears in the results list, I'll drag it over to the name box and drop it in. And then the last thing I want to do on this window is put a check in Notify Participants when they receive a work item. This will ensure that in my case, Bob gets an email when this task gets assigned to him. And then from there, we'll go to the next screen where we will configure the email message that goes to Bob. On the event notification screen here, you can customize the email that is sent to the participant when the task is assigned to that user. So for this sample, go ahead and select the option to customize the notification message. Then notice the fields on the wizard screen are now enabled. In the subject text box, type New Site Request. And then the next thing we want to do is use the title field from the item reference in the context browser on the right. So go over to the context browser and open up Item References, and then open up SharePoint Site Request to expose all the fields from our SharePoint list. And then drag Title over to the subject line. We also want to make the body of the message a little bit more meaningful for the reviewer. So to do this, we'll add some extra text in just below the salutation. And then from the context browser on the right, drag and drop Site Type in the slot between the text, and also add title to the end of the sentence. Now the last thing that we want to add into the body of the message is the originator's full name. That way, the person that receives this message will know who submitted the request. So to get the originator full name, go over to the context browser on the right and open up the Workflow Context group. From inside there, you can drag and drop the originator's full name and drop it in at the beginning of the sentence that we just added into the body of the message. So now suppose that Cody requested a new team site with the title Cody Testing. The resulting email message to Bob will look something like this. So looking at this message, it gives Bob enough information to decide whether to reply to the email with approve or reject without having to open the form. Of course, Bob can still open the form if he wants to, or complete the task using the K2 Worklist app part in SharePoint. Giving users enough information in an email notification is an efficient way to let users complete their K2 tasks offline or in mobile situations, or without having to open a user interface. You don't always have to enable your workflow in this fashion because in some regulatory situations, you may need to require a user to open a form no matter what, and review information before actioning the task. So we'll go ahead and finish this out. You should see the workflow task with 2 lines or outcomes coming out of this user task. The workflow will follow one of the possible paths based on the action selected by the participant. This is the end of step 4.2, so let's go back and review. You've created a workflow step where a particular user will make a decision about the new site request. Based on that decision, the workflow will then follow a particular path. Okay, so in step 4.3, we want to build the steps for the rejected path of the workflow. When the SmartForms task participant rejects a site request, we want the workflow to send the site requester or workflow originator an email notification stating that their request has been rejected. Then we're going to update the status column of the request item in the SharePoint list so that it reflects the rejected action as well. So let's move on and build this section out in our workflow. If the participant in our SmartForms task rejects the site request, the first thing we want to do is send an email notification back to the originator or person that requested the site to let them know that their request has been rejected. Let's do that by using the Send Email step to configure this notification by locating it in the Workflow Steps tab of the ribbon menu. It's under both the Exchange Group menu option or the General Group menu option. Once you've located it, drag it down to the empty slot that appears in the reject path of the workflow. And then you should see the Send Email wizard appear. The first thing we want to do in here is configure where we want the email message to go. We're going to use the originator of the workflow to do that. So select the Workflow Context group in the context browser on the right. And from there, drag and drop the originator email field over to the To text box. Now we'll configure the subject line of the message so that it indicates which site request was rejected. The first thing I'll do is add some text to the message. And then to indicate which request was rejected, I'll drag and drop the title into the subject line in the middle of my text. You may also want to include some context about this request in the body of your email message. You can use any text or values that you'd like, or you can follow my example here. For the sake of time, I'm going to paste in some text, and then I'm going to drop in the originator's full name, the site type, the title, and also the created date. And I'll grab that from the SharePoint Site Requests item reference in the context browser on the right. That's it for the email message, so when you're finished with that, go ahead and click OK and we'll move on to the next step. The next thing that we want to do is update the status column for the site request item in the SharePoint list so that it states that the request has been rejected. To do this, add a new outcome to the Send Email step by hovering over it and clicking the Workflow Step Outcomes icon that appears. And in the window that pops up, we'll add a new outcome by clicking the Add button and call this outcome Continue. And once you get that set, click OK and we'll move on. The next step of this path will take on the task of updating the site request list items status column with a rejected notice. To do this, go up to the Workflow Steps ribbon menu tab and select the List Items category from the menu. And then drag and drop the Update List Items step onto the blank slot that was just created off the Send Email Continue outcome. When the Specify a Reference or Select a Site Collection window appears, we can just use the default settings here, so move on to the next window. You should now see the Specify Values screen appear next. Add the word Rejected to the text box next to Site Status. This will update the list item in SharePoint with a rejected status, which then gives us the capability to provide historical reporting as well as the ability to enable grouping and sorting views on the status column in the site request list. That's it for the Update List Item wizard for this step. So when you finish, your workflow should look like mine on the screen. The reject path will be complete with a send email message step along with an update list item step to finish it up. And in looking at this design, I'm not very excited about the names of the workflow steps as they are not very descriptive in our workflow here. Take for instance, update list item and update list item 1 at the beginning and end of our workflow. Let's take a moment to rename some of these steps so they will have more meaning not only for us, but perhaps the next person that will be reviewing this workflow. You can change the name of a step either by double-clicking on the middle of the step icon and changing it on the first window that opens up. But just make sure to walk through the wizard and finish it so that it will save. You can also double-click on the text part of the step and change the text right on the canvas. Let's change the text for the send email notification step to send reject notification. Then change the text for update list item 1 to set status rejected. And finally change update list item at the beginning to set status pending. Also notice the full text of the step name may not show up on the design canvas, but it will be saved in the workflow, especially for clarity at runtime. With that, we're done with step 4.3. So save your workflow by clicking on the File menu option at the top, and then select Save. It's always a good idea to try to save these workflows when you're working on them from time to time, just to be safe. So let's review step 4.3. We've now implemented the reject path of the workflow. Note that it is not necessary to add an end step to the workflow, and K2 will stop executing the workflow when there's nowhere else to go. In our workflow's reject path, K2 will stop the workflow once it finishes the set status rejected step. Now let's take some time to move on and build the approve path of this workflow. Step 4.4 will take on building out the approval path by adding server tasks to create the SharePoint site and also update the request list item with a status of site created along with a couple other data points. Now let's go back to the workflow design canvas and get started. Once the SmartForm participant approves the site request, you can immediately have the workflow jump into creating the SharePoint site by selecting the Sites Group menu option from the Workflow Steps ribbon menu tab at the top of the page. Drag and drop the Create Site step onto the empty slot that appears in the Approve path off of the SmartForm user task on your design canvas. And then when the Create Site window appears, you have the option to select the site collection you would like to have this new site created under. Your list values may be a bit different than the values shown on my screen, so select the collection that makes the most sense for you. You may also want the new site to be created under a specific subsite in the site collection you selected above. So enter the relative path to that subsite in the Subsite Relative URL text box next. In my case, I'll enter in Learning K2, since that is the subsite where I want my new sites created. This value is also optional, so if you don't provide a value here, the workflow will create the site in the top level of your selected site collection. Now for the title and description fields, we're going to use the SharePoint Site Request List Item reference in the context browser to drag and drop the title and description fields for that list into these text boxes. The values entered in by the requester in these fields will be used in these properties. Now let's take a look at the URL property next. A site's URL has to be URL safe. In other words, no special characters or spaces. An easy way to do this is to use a unique number like the process ID, which is an automatically incrementing number that K2 assigns to each process instance. While you could use the title value here, it may not be a good idea because users could enter in special characters in the title field. You could also use an inline function to generate or calculate a value for the URL as well. But to keep things simple, we'll just use the ID of the workflow instance as the URL for the new site. That will ensure that sites are always unique. So to get to that, from the context browser, open up the Workflow Context group. and grab the ID field from there and drag it into the relative URL text box. Now let's look at Site Template. The Site Template allows you to select the SharePoint site template you want this site to be created with. You can select from the drop-down list on the screen here, or click on the button next to the drop-down and enter in a value as text. Or, if you recall, earlier we gave the user a drop-down list of site templates to pick from on their request form. Let's go back to the item reference for the SharePoint list in the context browser and drag the site type column onto the template field. We'll use the value selected by the user to designate the site template. Next, make sure there's a check in the Create Site Reference checkbox just below Template. And then also, name the site reference New Site. We want to save a reference or pointer to this new site in our workflow so that we can easily retrieve values for the new site in later steps. I'll show you how that works with the next Update List Item step once we get there. And finally, make sure there's also a check in the Use Existing Site on Site if Match Found checkbox. If a site with the same name already exists, we want to make sure that we just use that site that does exist. This is unlikely in the scenario that we're building because we're using a unique number as the relative URL for the new site. And this is all we have to do on this window. Click OK to finish the new site wizard, and then your workflow should look like this. You should see the Create Site added to the Approve path at this point. From here, let's add a new outcome to the Create Site step called Continue. Again, you can do this by going into the Outcomes dialog that's attached to the Create Site step, and then configure the possible outcomes and add one in here called Continue, and then save it. Now that we have the new site created, let's give some information back to the requester about this site. In this next step, we'll do that by updating the list item record with a new status, the new URL for the site, and the date when the site was created. Go up to the ribbon menu and select List Items from the menu group on the left and drag Update List Items down to the blank slot on the workflow canvas. In this window, add Site Created to the Site Status text box. Next, recall that we selected to have a site reference created in the Create Site Wizard step previously. When you do this, a pointer to the properties of the new site gets created in K2, which allows you to access these properties later on in workflow steps such as this one. So open up Item References from the context browser, and then open up the new site reference item from the list, and drag the URL property over to the Link to Site text box in the window. And the last piece of the puzzle to this window is updating the Site Created On column with the current date and time when the site's created. So to do this, we want to open up the Inline Functions group from the context browser on the right. And then from in there, open up the Date and Time group and drag down the Now function to the Site Created On column. When you're finished with this wizard, close it out, and then rename this step to Update Site Request Item. And once you finish that, add a new outcome and call it Continue so that we can prepare for the next task that we have to add. So in looking at your workflow now, you should see in the approval path a Create Site step, and then also a step to update the site request with some pertinent information. While you save your workflow, I'll go back and review what we just did. We have added the server steps for the approved path of the workflow where K2 will create the new site in SharePoint and then update a list item in SharePoint with the information about the new site. In our next step, we'll add a user task for the requester to notify them about their new site and to put a task in their work list so that they can decide at some point in the future whether they want to keep this site or delete it. In order to help alleviate SharePoint site sprawl, we've built this process with the thought of keeping the sites in this site collection temporary in nature. We're at the point in our process where we want to assign a user task to the site requester to ask them if they would like to keep the site or have it deleted. We'll also configure it with an escalation period of 14 days from the site creation date. So let's begin by going up to the Workflow Steps ribbon menu, open up the list of steps under the User Tasks or General group again, and drag the Smart Forms task down to the empty slot on the approved path of your workflow. And the first window that pops up is the User Task window. Here we'll go ahead and name this task Keep or Delete New Site. We'll also put some instructions in the instructions text box here for the user, stating please indicate whether to keep or delete the new SharePoint site. And we'll also add two outcomes to this user task, keep site and delete site. And we'll move on to the next window once we fill that in. For the user form, we don't want the user to make any changes to the request. So we'll go ahead and change this to the Display SharePoint Site Request form instead of the Edit SharePoint Site Request form. So to do this, click on the ellipse at the end of the text box. And then scroll down to the SharePoint Site Requests group and select Display SharePoint Site Requests for the form. This will ensure that the form users get is the read-only version of the SharePoint list item. So moving on to the user form screen, we don't need to make any changes here to the rules, so leave them set at their default values. And we'll move on to the participant screen. We want this task to be assigned to the person that requested this SharePoint site to be created. So in this case, it happens to be the originator of the workflow. And K2 makes that easy for us here on the search results screen by default by presenting us with the originator and that person's manager in the results. So drag originator over to the name box and drop it in there. And then select notify participants when they receive a work item so that they get an email once the task is assigned to them. And for that notification, we want to add a little context to it. So let's customize the notification message. And then for my subject line, I'll type in site created for site request. And from the context browser on the right, open up the SharePoint Site Requests item reference and drag the title over to the subject line. And once you've completed that, we'll move down to the body of the message. We also want to include some information here to let the user connect directly to their site. So in the body section of the email, after the first line, add some descriptive text to this message. Feel free to use what I enter in here or come up with whatever you'd like to include here yourself. You can pause the video here if you'd like to take some time to enter this in. Okay, the final thing that we want to add to the body of this message is a link to the new site for the user. So we can get that from the new site item reference that we had created in the Create Site wizard previously in the workflow. So if you don't have item references open in the context browser yet, open up item references and then open up the new site group reference. And from there, drag and drop the URL field over to the body of your message. And that's the last thing we need to do with this wizard, so finish it out. And then your workflow should look something like this. You have your user task with two outcomes coming out of it, one for keep site and the other for delete site. Moving on, so on occasion, users tend to forget that they have tasks assigned to them that require attention within a reasonable amount of time. When the site requester in this workflow receives this task immediately after their site is created, we want to remind them to make the decision if they want to keep the site or delete it after a period of 14 days should they forget to action this task at that point. To set this up, we want to add an escalation to this user task. So right-click on Keep or Delete New Site, and then select Escalations from the menu. The escalation window gives you the ability to add multiple escalations to a user task if you choose to take advantage of that. In this guide, we will only add our 14-day escalation that sends an email notice to the assigned user to the task. If the user still doesn't action the task, this is the window where you might add a second escalation that sends a notice to the user's manager. When you add an escalation in this window, you will configure the escalation with the following settings. go ahead and name it Send Reminder. Then add in a helpful description to describe what this escalation is intended to do. You could also redirect the task to another user or set it to expire and be removed from the user's task list for escalation type. However, ensure that email is the type of escalation selected for now. And finally, in the escalation settings section, make sure that Escalate After is selected. And then enter 14 in the text box just below that, and then from the drop-down select Days. This escalation will fire 14 days after the site is created if the user has not decided whether or not to keep the site. If the user already completed the task within 14 days, this escalation will not fire. Let's move on and configure the email notification that goes out for this escalation. I want this email to go to the originator of this workflow, so select Send Email to Originator. And then we're going to add some context to the subject line, so I'll enter this information in here. And then from the Item References group in the context browser, open up the SharePoint Site Request list and add the title into the subject line. And from there, I'll add a meaningful message into the body of this email message. Feel free to enter in whatever you would like to enter in here. You can pause this video at this point in time if you'd like to enter in some text. And finally, I'll drag the title into the body of the message as well. And that pretty much sums it up for the escalation on this task. So I'll finish it up, and we'll go through a quick review of what we just did. In this step, you added a task for the originator to decide whether or not to keep the new site, and added an escalation for this task to the originator to complete their task. In step 4.6, you will build out the delete site path of the workflow by configuring the delete subsite step, as well as updating the site request list item's status in SharePoint with the fact that the site was deleted. So if the user chooses to delete their site instead of keeping it, we can use the Delete Subsite wizard from the Sites group up in the ribbon menu at the top of the page. Drag and drop the Delete Subsite workflow step onto the blank slot that follows the delete site path from the Keep or Delete Site user task. Notice that a wizard does not pop up when you drop this on your design canvas. This is because K2 recognizes the new site item reference you added earlier and assumes that this is the site we want to delete here. Feel free to pause the video and double-click the Delete Site step if you want to check out the properties that you can configure. The next task involves adding a new outcome to the Delete Site step and calling it Continue. And then we'll add an Update List Item step into the blank slot that is created from this outcome in order to update the list item's status with information indicating the site is deleted. So select List Items from the menu at the top of the page and grab the Update List Items step and drop it on the design canvas at the end of the delete site path. Go ahead and leave the default configuration for the list item setting and move on to the next window. In this window, you'll update two columns with text. Add Site Deleted to the text box next to the Site Status column, and also add Site Deleted to the Link to Site text box. This will eliminate the dead link so that users don't try to go to the site from this point on. So I'll finish that up, and that's all we have to do for step 4.6. Now we'll move on and update the Keep Site path. For step 4.7, we'll finish out the Keep Site path of the workflow. We'll add an email task here to the requester with a notification that their site will be retained. Finishing out the Keep Site path will be fairly simple. The only thing we're going to do here is send an email notification back to the originator of the workflow to let them know that their site will be retained. So from the ribbon menu at the top of the page, select the General group, and from inside there, grab the Send Email step and drag and drop it down to the empty slot in the Keep Site path. And from here, we'll configure this to go to the originator by grabbing the originator email field over in the context browser on the right. and then add a little bit of context to the subject line with whatever text you'd like to put in here. I'll enter in SharePoint site and then drop title in after that, and then also give them a message that says will be retained. And then I'll also fill in some information in the body of the message and drop the title field in there as well. Feel free to drop whatever kind of text you want in that message. And from here, save that out and go up to the File menu at the top of the page and save your workflow. In step 5, you will learn how to deploy the workflow directly from the Workflow Design tool so that the application can use it. Now that we've completed the design phase of this workflow, we need to deploy it so that it is tied into our SharePoint site list and can be used by the application. From the Workflow Design tool, select File from the toolbar at the top of the page. Then select Deploy from the menu options. The deploying workflow to the server task will run, and you should see a success message in a few seconds. You'll have the option to close or close and exit. If you close, you can close this window out and it will leave you in the Workflow Design window and you can continue working on the workflow. In this case, we're going to click Close and Exit on the Success Message dialog box. Then you will be directed to the K2 application elements for the new application. And from this screen, you could open the various elements in the solution to modify them if needed. Note the forms and views that K2 created, which are the forms that will be used when users create, view, and edit items in the SharePoint list. You should also see a few smart objects, which are the data objects that will make the SharePoint list available for use in the forms and the workflow. And finally, you should see one workflow. We're done building this application at this point, so click on the SharePoint Site Requests link at the top of the page to get back to the SharePoint list for this application. At this point, the application is done and all the required pieces have been generated and deployed. So in step 6, we're going to run the application and test it. In step 6.1, we're going to create 2 new site requests. K2 will create a workflow for each list item. So also keep in mind, if you selected a different user to approve the site requests in step 4.2 and you're in your own office environment, you may want to let this person know to expect these tasks soon. If you selected yourself as the site request approver in step 4.2, you can perform all the test steps yourself. If you're not already in your list, open up the SharePoint Site Requests list. And then near the top of the page, click New Item. For each of these items, we're going to add basically just 2 test items. For the first test item, put First Test Site in the title text box. And then for site description, enter in, this is the first test site. And for site template, you can select any of the available site templates in the drop-down list. If you're not sure which one to use, go ahead and select Team Site. And then save that back to the list. And then we'll do the same thing for the second test record. So go ahead and click New Item again. And in our title text box, put Second Test Site. And then for description, go ahead and just say, this is the second test site. And whatever site template you selected in the previous test record, select the other one here. So I selected Team Site before. I'll go ahead and select Project Site, and then I'll save it out. Now behind the scenes, the workflow should start. And go ahead and try to refresh this page a couple times. You should see the 2 new items in the list, and each with a status of pending approval, signifying that our workflow wrote back to the list. For step 6.2, you're going to use the K2 Worklist app part or your email client to approve the new site requests that you just created. Take note, if you did select a specific user to approve that new site request in your organization, you'll need to have that user perform these steps. After we created the 2 test records, the workflow will assign a task to the user that we identified in step 4.3. In your case, if this is you, return to the landing page of your SharePoint site and you should see the two site approval tasks on the K2 work list app part. They should be waiting for you to action there. If you selected somebody else in your organization, let that user know that they will need to approve the new site request so that your new sites are created. In my case, I selected Bob, so I'll flip over to Bob's browser. And here you can see that Bob has two tasks sitting in the work list. So I'll open the context menu for the first test site task and click the Open Form option. We can see the details entered for the first test site request here on this form. Also notice that we have the option to make some changes because of the form that we used in the workflow settings. We can change some of the site information and save it back to the list. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and approve this request by selecting Approve from the Select Action drop-down list, and then I'll save it back and submit it. Then return to the landing page of your SharePoint site. I'll do that here. You should see that the first test site task has disappeared from the list because we just completed it. If that's not the case, go ahead and refresh your browser and you should see that task disappear. Okay, for the second test site we requested to have created, open up an email client for the person that you assign the task to. If that's you, open yours up. In my case, I'll open up Bob's email client. You should see an email notification from K2 asking you to approve or reject the new site request. Locate the request for the second test site and reply to the email with just the word approve in the body of the message. If you'd like to, you can always go back to the K2 work list app part and approve the second test site request as well. And after a minute or two, you should receive a confirmation email from the K2 server notifying you that the task has been actioned. I'll pause the video here and then we'll come back and I'll refresh to show you those messages. Now you can see that we do have two messages here that basically say that we've successfully completed the approve and new site request task. For step 6.3, we'll review the new sites and then we'll also decide if we want to keep or delete these two sites. And we'll do this by opening the new sites that were created and review the site settings to confirm that the title and description were set correctly. Then we'll take a look at the email that was sent with the information with the new site in it. And then finally, we'll go back to the K2 work list app part and we'll action the tasks to keep or delete the sites based on that information. Now return to the SharePoint site requests list if you're not in there already. You should see that the list items are now updated with the approval status as well as a link to the new sites that were created. If you click on the link to one of the sites, you should be taken to that new site. Once you're in there, open up the site settings for this site and then take a look at the site title and site description to make sure that it uses the values you provided when requesting the new site. You will also see that the site URL uses the unique number, which if you recall, it was the number that was used as the ID of the workflow once it started. Go back to your K2 work list at this point. You should also see two tasks in that work list, which are where you can decide whether you want to keep or delete these new sites. Also, open up your email client and you should see new email from the K2 server with information about your new sites. You have the ability to reply to these emails with your decision to keep or delete the site as well. For each of your new sites, either reply to the email notification with keep site or delete site, or go ahead and use the K2 work list app part to select keep site or delete site actions. Keep in mind, if you select the delete site action, go back and make sure that the list item in the SharePoint site requests list has a site status set to site deleted and also the link to site column set to site deleted. If everything worked as expected, congratulations! Your SharePoint site provisioning application is now ready for use. Step 7 is an optional step that will take a look at reporting for the K2 application we just built. If you would like to learn how to use the K2 reports page in the SharePoint site requests list To run the Workflow Instances report and Activity Instances report, feel free to stick with me. We'll also take a look at a view flow report for a running workflow instance. If you recall back when we created the K2 application for this list, we also chose to have reports created that will summarize workflow activity for this list. So if you're in the SharePoint Site Requests list, click on the List tab at the top of the screen, and then from the ribbon bar select Report in the K2 section. Once the Reports page opens, you'll notice a bar chart that lists the number of workflow instances for the SharePoint Site Requests workflow currently. Go ahead and click on that bar chart, and at this point you should see 2 instances appear in the Workflow Instances report on the right. Now select one of those instances, and you should see a listing of the steps for that workflow instance in the Activity Instances report that appears near the bottom of the page. This report basically shows you information about each of these activities or steps that you created in your workflow. So you'll get to see duration for that activity, date it was assigned, date it was completed, the priority for it, and its current status. In the list of workflow instances, there's also an icon that allows you to open the view flow report for any instance to see the path that was followed for that workflow. Remember that you can click on any step of the view flow report for information about that step, like the person who approved the new site request. This gives you information about when their task was started, when it was finished, and the action that they took. Step 8 is also an optional step that will show you how to modify forms and views for the application you just built by removing the site status, link to site, and site created on rows from the new SharePoint Site Requests view. You will also get to see how the checkout and check-in functionality works around that view to prevent others from editing and seeing your changes until you've completed your work. In some cases, you may need to change your application after it has been deployed. In our SharePoint Site Requests application that we just built, there's no need to show the site status, link to site, or site created on fields on the form that users use to request a new site. So in this step, we'll go ahead and remove those fields from the new item form. In order to do this, we need to get to the K2 Artifacts page. So in your SharePoint Site Requests list, click on the Application button under the K2 group in the ribbon bar at the top of the page under the List tab. And from the Artifacts page, we want to edit the new SharePoint Site Request view. So select that view in the list, and then click the Edit link in the top menu. After a few seconds, the K2 Designer should appear, and you should see the view layout with all the text boxes that we want to remove. Make a note, K2 Designer is a web-based design tool that you can use to edit forms, smart objects, and workflows that K2 creates for your SharePoint-based application. On our new item form, our user doesn't really need to see the site status, link to site, or site created on fields at this point, because the workflow will do the editing of those fields later on. So we're going to remove those from this form. In order to do that, click on the Site Status text box, and a dialog box should pop up asking you whether you want to check out the view or not. Views and forms must be checked out before you make changes to them. You can save your changes at any time, but the changes will not be visible to other users until you've checked in the view or the form. So go ahead and confirm that you want to check this document out. And then after it's checked out, select the text box next to Site Status and press the Delete key to remove it from the view. And then select the Site Status text and press the Delete key again. At this point, we'll go ahead and repeat those steps for the link to site and site created on fields. Once you're done with that, the view that you have on your screen should look like mine. Now we have a bunch of blank rows on this view. So let's get rid of those by selecting one of the blank rows, and then in the toolbar at the top, click the Remove Row button as shown here. And once you've done that, let's repeat that for each of the blank rows that we just created. Now your view should look like mine with these rows gone. Be careful not to delete a row with anything in it, such as a save or cancel button. There aren't any more changes that we want to make to this view, so at the bottom of the screen, click on the Save icon to save this view back to K2 in SharePoint. And then once you're done, finish that form out. And when you finish, you will be directed back to the K2 Elements page. Take a look and notice that the new SharePoint Site Request view is still checked out, which means at this point other users will not be able to see the changes we just made. So to check this back in, right-click on the new SharePoint Site Requests view. And when you see the menu pop up, select Check In from that menu. Okay, good. So now let's go review this form and make sure that it looks the way we want it to look. Click on the SharePoint Site Requests link at the top of the screen to go back to the SharePoint list for this application. And then click on the New Item link. When the new form is displayed, you should now see that the fields no longer appear in this form. The fields are still in the SharePoint list and will still be updated by the workflow when a new site is created. That's the last step in this build guide, so let's take some time to go back and review what we've learned. By using the K2 Workflow application, we learned how we can automate SharePoint governance practices by building a SharePoint site provisioning application. You learned how to assign user tasks and enable escalations on those tasks if users forget to action them in a reasonable amount of time. To promote reuse capabilities and cut down on design time, you also learned how to use item references within the designer to access properties within multiple steps throughout the design of your workflow. You learned how to drill in to view the status and metrics around your workflow instances by running the K2 generated reports tied into your application. We also took a look at the ability to generate K2 Smart Forms and views to replace the out-of-box SharePoint user interface forms, along with giving you the tools to modify those forms and views without complex design tools to give your users a less complicated experience while working with your application.